Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming out. I'm Mark Lycett. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies and the Program on the Global Environment. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's installment of our Global Energy Series. The Global Energy Series is presented by the Center for International Studies and co-sponsored by the Program on the Global Environment and the Agriculture and Food Working Group. Through its lectures, films, and discussions, Global Energies offers a public inquiry into the ecology, science, and politics of energy in the 21st century. Next in the series will be journalist Steve Levine talking on smog, natural gas, batteries, on the new geopolitics of energy. This event will take place in Ida Noy's library on Thursday, May 22nd at 5:30. I should also mention the talk by Daniel Cymene, originally scheduled for May 12th, has been postponed until the autumn. Apparently there's some politicians speaking on campus that night. Please visit globalenergies.uchicago.edu for updates and more information. This evening, we're privileged to hear from Cymene Howe and Dominic Boyer on wind at the margins of the state, autonomy, and renewable energy in southern Mexico. Cymene Howe is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Rice University. She earned her PhD in Cultural Anthropology from my alma mater, the University of New Mexico. Her acclaimed book, Intimate Activism, Sexual Rights in Post-Revolutionary Nicaragua, was published by Duke University Press in 2013. It analyzes how sexual rights activists in Nicaragua have reformulated their country's revolutionary history to create new models of sexual subjectivity and rights. Her current research project, about which we'll hear tonight, focuses on the development of wind parks and renewable energy projects in Oaxaca, Mexico, as well as the activist responses generated by these projects. Dominic Boyer is Professor of Anthropology at Rice University, Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences. He earned his PhD in Anthropology from the University of Chicago in 2000. His book, The Life Informatic, Newsmaking in the Digital Era, was published by Cornell University Press in 2013. It continues his groundbreaking research on news media and his concern with mediation that was also evident in his earlier works. His current research, in collaboration with Professor Howe, is the focus of this evening's talk. Tonight's event is, as I said, co-sponsored by CIS. It's also the Center for Latin American Studies, the Program on the Global Environment, and the Environment, Agriculture, and Food Working Group. And now please join me in welcoming Professors Howe and Boyer.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thank you, Andy and Tom, for technical wizardry and organizational prowess in getting us here. Thank you all for coming out. I know it's an evening of a beautiful day after a very long, very hard winter. So we appreciate you taking the time to come out and hear a bit about our research. This has been a collaborative project from the get-go, and so we're going to take turns reading different parts of it. We started the project, as Mark described, in 2009 when we moved to Rice, and spent last academic year, the 2012-2013 academic year, doing a full year of field research in southern Mexico on this project, funded by the National Science Foundation, for which we're very grateful. And I guess the only other thing I'll say, because the talk is largely self-explanatory, I think, in terms of getting background and sort of what the major issues and dynamics are in this case, is just to say that this particular piece is a piece that we're working to have translated into Spanish as well, so it can be published bilingually, in part because it's something that we're hoping that will help to make somewhat of an impact in Mexico for reasons that will become clear as we go on. We're in a situation of impasse and a great deal of political contention surrounding renewable energy development. That's something we care about, but of course we also care about indigenous rights, indigenous sovereignty, and the two of them have found themselves sort of at cross purposes there at the moment. And the other thing I'll say is that what we're working towards right now is writing not two monographs, but rather one duograph, and that based on this project. And if that formulation intrigues you in any way, feel free to ask more about that afterwards. So let me just launch in here. And there we are. Okay. So we'll start with an encounter with transnational green capitalism on the frontier of Mexican statecraft. It happened in February 2013 in Oaxaca's Isthmus of Tehuantepec, where a state police checkpoint had been set up just before the road from the district capital, Juchitán, turned southeast toward the village of Ávaro, Obregón. Checkpoint does somewhat overstate the formality of the situation. There were a few state police trucks idling by the side of the road, near several weathered wooden canoes, signs of having crossed into the fishing zone of the Laguna Superior. The police half-heartedly reviewed our papers, but only because we asked Senor Tomas, our taxi driver for the day, to stop the car. A representative of the Oaxacan government had told us that morning that the situation in Ávaro was very tense. The police were reporting trucks filled with men driving around the village, brandishing sticks and machetes, threatening violence. Senor Tomas, by contrast, assured us we had very little to worry about. Driving through the verdant ranchland south of Juchitán, he had explained how resistance is always tied to money in the Isthmus. Quote, "This is how it always is. People make a lot of noise about this or this other thing. But it's only because they want to be paid. And when they get paid, all this resistance will dry up. You'll see." What we didn't expect to see on that road, and the reason why we asked Senor Tomas to pull over, were two gringos talking to the local police commander. The tall one turned out to be someone we'd been pursuing for some time, Andrew Chapman, part of the senior management team of Mareña Renovables, a consortium seeking to build the largest single-phase wind park in all of Latin America, 132 turbines with a production capacity of 396 megawatts, enough electricity to power nearly 500,000 homes. But everyone around Juchitán knew that Mareña was in deep trouble. Its park was designed to stretch across a sandbar at the southern end of the laguna from the Binisa, or Zapotec community of Ávaro, across to the Icots, or Wave communities of Santa Maria del Mar and San Dionisio del Mar. Originally scheduled for completion by the end of 2012, the project suffered delay after delay before becoming the focal point for a resistance movement against wind power organized by Asambleas Populares, popular assemblies, across the lagunal region. The asambleas are, as Cymene will discuss in more detail, community-level self-governance projects united against all governmental and industrial megaproyectos, or megaprojects, in the region. By the end of 2012, blockades have been erected in both Ávaro and San Dionisio to prevent the inception of Mareña's construction, and crisis ensued. Indeed, just the day before our taxi ride, the president of Mareña's board of directors, Jonathan Davis Arsac, had threatened that the company, in what they estimated to be a 13 billion peso, or that's about $1 billion, a 13 billion peso investment would leave Oaxaca unless what he termed rule of law could be guaranteed. Davis claimed that there were only 20 well-identified people resisting the park, what he and the Oaxacan news media characterized as a violent and unscrupulous minority of political opportunists, most of them not even from the region, who were blackmailing project developers. Mareña was unwilling or unable to believe that large numbers of Isthmians would reject a project that the developers viewed as hugely beneficial to them. And this is what it would have looked like, serene, tranquilo, if it had been built. It's a computer simulation generation modeling of what the park might have looked like. Now, even if we had come to be suspicious about the public minimization, demonization of the opposition movement, we found it hard not to sympathize with Chapman personally. He spoke to us openly, shouting himself hoarse over the wind. He seemed like a man desperate to be heard. "My job is to go in there and try to open a dialogue and go listen, but I can't do that with threats of violence. The only way to change minds is to listen to people. But if you're not allowed to listen to people, what do? We've got this project that I really believe is good for the planet, good for the region, good for the people down here." And the people, Chapman felt sure, would come around. You can't help but be stunned by the beauty of this place, and then when you see how the people are living, and I'm trying not to just impose my American values here, but I don't think lousy medical care is a good thing, that lousy schools are a good thing. So if you can funnel resources into these communities to improve those services, imagine where they could be in 5 or 10 years. They can still be fishing the lagoon if they want to, but they'd have basic stuff like electricity that's continuous, like transportation, like schools. It may sound very idealistic, but that's actually what we're trying to do. And to be confronted with this violence and with people who are essentially lying about what we're trying to accomplish, he trailed off. The conflict was obviously wearying him, and a moment later he concluded, I just find it frustrating and sad, and the consequence is that the investor group I represent, they're sitting in their offices, and they can put their money here, and they can put their money there, and they're just going to say to themselves, why? I don't need these problems. I'm not actually in the business of saving the world. I'm in the business of earning money for my fiduciaries, and I need to do that in a low-risk way. More bad news came minutes later from the police. There was no way they were going to advise Chapman to enter Avaro that day. The risks were, as predicted, too high. The state police have come to treat those opposing the wind park with a great deal of caution. Memories are still fresh of the previous November when Mareña and the police tested the Avaro blockade during the Day of the Dead festival, when many in the resistance were elsewhere tending to the graves of deceased family and friends. With several protesters hauled off to detention in Juchitán and others quieted with pepper spray, the blockade was temporarily broken, allowing company workers to access the sandbar and begin topographic and vegetation removal work. But only hours later, a much larger crowd of several hundred rallied to chase the police and company off, overturning trucks and taking construction equipment hostage. We arrived in Avaro only minutes after the police sped out of town to find the opposition more galvanized than ever. One of the leaders told us, machete at his hip, if they want to see blood, here we are, we're ready. The police never quite found the nerve to come back, and construction on the Mareña Renovables park has still not, as of today, begun, and indeed it seems increasingly likely that it will never begin, and that the project will fail despite strong support from all levels of Mexican government, generous international financing, despite new policy regimes favorable to renewable energy development, despite almost uniformly positive media coverage in the national and regional press, and despite the leverage of powerful international investors, including the Australian investment bank Macquarie and the Japanese firm Mitsubishi. The marriage of Mexico's aggressive renewable energy campaign, the high electricity tariffs, and the world-class wind resources of the Isthmus seem to all parties to be highly auspicious. In a matter of less than a decade, more than a dozen wind parks have come on grid in Mexico, according to industry experts, the densest development of wind energy anywhere in the world. Investors continue to flock to the Isthmus, while international renewable energy advocates have lauded Oaxacan wind power development for its positive contribution to climate change. The Mareña project alone could offset up to 879,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year. But Mareña is above all a story about impasse and failure. And in this paper, we'd like to explore the reasons why such a diversely supported and ecologically timely project never came to be. Staying true to the complexity of the case, and in lieu of an argument for a single decisive causality, we offer a bundle of reflections on the diverse challenges facing programs of energy transition, especially in parts of the world like the Isthmus of Tehuantepec that have long been marginalized or abandoned by their governing states. Of course, it's no secret that large-scale projects of energy development are often controversial, especially when the intense energy needs of translocal governance and industry are perceived as threatening local sovereignty and interests. And Mexico has been no stranger to such conflicts until the 1980s. Mexico had the largest population displaced by hydropower projects anywhere in the world. But the Isthmus of Tehuantepec also has a long political and cultural history of resistance to the hegemony of Oaxaca Valley elites and to the nationalist overtures and arms of Mexico City. Few histories of the Isthmus, formal or informal, do not invoke and reinscribe an Isthmeño tradition of struggle against external power. Narratives often begin before the Spanish conquest, with Isthmeños depicted as the last true Zapotecs after the Aztecs made the northern Zapotecs their minions, assimilating them culturally and linguistically. Then one is reminded of revolt after revolt in the 19th century, of how national and Oaxacan hero Benito Juárez never broke the will of Juchitán, even though he burned it. One hears how brave Juchitecos later fought valiantly against the French invasion of Mexico and helped to secure the victory of the Mexican Revolution. But when that national revolution turned corrupt in the second half of the 20th century, Isthmeños rose again with their peasant and student movement COSEI, helping to accelerate the dissolution of the PRI party state in the 1980s. In all such stories, the Isthmus is frequently identified as the place where the sovereign powers of Oaxacan state and Mexican national governance end, where, as in Álvaro Obregón, the police fear to tread. Yet Mareña's impasse also has reasons quite contemporary, illuminating deep tensions and paradoxes in dominant paradigms of renewable energy development across the world. As elsewhere in neoliberalism, Market and entrepreneur-oriented approaches to energy transition are trumpeted as the most effective and rational solutions to anthropogenic climate change. Large-scale renewable energy projects like wind parks are also highly capital-intensive and thus become tightly bound to finance capitalism and to expectations for a positive return on shareholder investment. Thus, even though green energy projects typically speak a language of environmental sustainability, the growth imperative of dominant models of economic health bleeds over into and directs them. Communities, perhaps especially indigenous communities, with resources like land, water, and wind that can be harnessed for renewable energy megaprojects, often find their own interests subverted to those of states and corporations desperately searching for an alchemy of growth, profit, and sustainability in the shadow of the Anthropocene. And there are more complications still. Oaxacan wind power development needs to be understood not only as a response to climate change, but also to the vulnerability of the Mexican petrostate. Although peak oil fears have dissipated in some countries with the rise of shale oil and gas extraction, in Mexico such concerns remain both strong and empirically substantiated. Mexican heavy crude production fell 46% from 2004 to 2012, with its only supergiant field, Cantarell, running dry, and the national oil monopoly, Pemex, widely believed to lack the expertise and resources to effectively develop deep-water hydrocarbon resources, the Mexican petrostate finds itself at its own crossroads. In recent years, Pemex has supplied as much as 40% of the operating budget of the Mexican federal government, meaning that all aspects of Mexican statecraft, all of the biopolitical projects that Chapman and others mentioned, depend critically upon revenue from oil sales. The crude production drop has been masked to some extent by a concomitant rise in international oil prices, which has allowed Pemex to retain high revenue. But put bluntly, the current financial model for the Mexican state is only one big drop in the international price of oil away from disaster. President Felipe Calderón's push to rapidly develop renewable energy resources was formulated in precisely this context. As an official in the Mexican Environmental Ministry, Semarnat explained to us, we need to diversify the sources of our electricity production. The hydrocarbons we don't use for our own energy consumption are hydrocarbons we can sell at a good price. And this is what I've termed energopolitics in action, fuel and electricity guiding the operation of political power invisibly from within. In the fading light of the black sun of oil, new energopolitical models are emerging as part of a massive but still aptly subterranean effort to sustain the petropolitical growth model. In Mexico, political interest in the wind resources of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec dates back to the early 1990s. However, it was only during Calderón's presidency, when drug cartel power soared and oil began to wane, that a serious campaign to develop renewable energy began. New legislation was passed demanding 35% clean electricity by 2024, alongside lucrative incentives for new private-public partnerships in renewable energy development. The Mexican wind power sector exploded. In 2008, there were only 2 parks producing 84.9 megawatts, and only 4 years later, there were 15 parks producing over 1,300 megawatts, a 1,467% increase that made Mexico the second biggest wind power producer in Latin America after Brazil. The dominant development scheme has been industrial self-supply, or autoabastecimiento, partnerships in which a private wind developer contracts to produce energy for a large industrial client, such as Cemex, Walmart, or FEMSA Heineken, over a period of decades. These schemes are typically portrayed as win-win-win for the government, developers, and industry. Companies can lock in lower than market energy prices for a long term, enjoy the financial benefits of carbon credits, and guarantee themselves secure energy supply. Developers enjoy special financing through schemes like the UN's Clean Development Mechanism. States receive infrastructural development and economic multipliers without having to invest themselves. Communities are also frequently portrayed as winners in self-supply development in that they typically receive land rents and payments from usufructuary agreements. But many Isthmianos have come to doubt the benefits of autoabastecimiento wind development. And the Mareña project has helped focus these doubts and distill them into resistance for several reasons. First, Mareña is viewed by its critics as epitomizing a general lack of transparency in the development process. What's now known as the Mareña Renovables project has shifted owners, names, and footprints several times since the development began in 2003. Speculative activity was quite common in the early days of the Oaxacan wind rush, and we discovered significant evidence of a cartel-like organization created or tolerated by the Oaxacan state government, in which wind developers were essentially assigned exclusive negotiation rights over choice plots in the core wind zone. Many of these plots were flipped at a profit again and again without informing the communities which would be impacted. Communities were meanwhile never allowed to entertain competitive bids from different developers, which set remuneration rates at a low level by international standards. Also, speculators, knowing that they would not have to see these projects through to completion, frequently cut corners in terms of community relations and engagement. Years later, many Isthmians complain of having been given insufficient or inaccurate information regarding the impacts that projects would bring. In December 2012, a federal judge issued an injunction, an amparo, to halt progress on the Mareña Park in order to investigate opposition claims that indigenous land was being expropriated without prior information and consent, a violation of the Mexican Constitution. A second criticism frequently raised against Mareña is that it has sought, like many wind developers, to advance its project through manipulation of local authorities rather than through consensus-building projects with whole communities. The companies fervently deny these claims, but critics contend that contracts for exploration and land use rights were facilitated by bribes paid to mayors or commissariados, collective land commissioners, in the form of cash or trucks. There are wonderful tales of mysterious trucks disgorging still more mysterious men roaming twilight streets with suitcases filled with cash. And even when local authorities are not personally implicated in bribery or embezzlement, it's said that they only share new resources within their own political network, thus effectively privatizing what had initially been promised as a social good. This points to a third general area of complaint, that wind development in the Isthmus has accentuated social inequality, political polarization, and violence by deprioritizing general social benefits, again, the very schools and healthcare mentioned by Chapman, in favor of benefits to landholders. This is where most of the land rents in the wind zone are being concentrated now, into new luxury homes and cars for the landowning class. Wind is a lucrative business for local elites and funds political campaigns in machines and towns where votes are openly sold for 600 pesos or $45 a head. It's also good business for the construction unions, who have, in several cases, provided groups of golpeadores, thugs, to intimidate, threaten, and in some cases physically attack those who resist or oppose wind park projects. The Mareña project also possesses several singularities that have helped to make it a watershed case. It's uniquely impactful in that it would be the first park to affect a plurality of lagoonal communities, all of which have traditional rights of access to fishing near the sandbar. Likewise, it would be the first park to occupy land actively administered as bienes comunales, as common rather than private property. In all other cases, wind parks have occupied land that has been privatized either voluntarily or by force. It's also apparently the only wind farm project in the world designed to occupy a sandbar, thus making its environmental impacts especially difficult to estimate. There's little comparative evidence available, for example, to address locally burning questions such as whether the presence of turbines would create vibrations and shed light that would scare fish away. However, there is one causality that stands out prominently from the pack as the most immediate reason for Mareña's failure: the rise of the popular assembly network I mentioned a few minutes ago. Deserving far more than this brief mention, Cymene will now turn to a deeper analysis of the origins and goals of the anti-aeolic, as they call themselves, anti-wind resistance movement.
Okay. Back at the crossroads of green capitalist aspirations and the barricades of Álvaro Obregón, one is struck by the sheer quantity of dust that arises when trucks roll down the road. The dust is reason enough to wrap a handkerchief or a t-shirt around any and all respiratory orifices. Men in Álvaro are often outfitted this way, bare-chested with a thinning t-shirt shrouding their nose and mouth to keep the dirt out. Maybe the protective shirt is printed with the smiling face of a bygone political candidate, or maybe it is a rock and roll concert relic. In either case, the chronic cough that is audible everywhere in this little hamlet makes it seem as though this is a losing battle. Today, in front of the abandoned hacienda that the resistance has appropriated as their meeting place, T-shirts have been fashioned into masks by a group of young men with a more symbolic purpose, signaling a touch of outlaw, part Zapatista, part universal gangster. As they jump down from the back of a white pickup truck, even the T-shirt masks can't conceal the young men's smiles. They've just returned from an excursion to the site where Mareña has its test tower, a spindly metal steeple with a three-pronged wind vane to meter the quality, duration, and force of the wind. The masked men have something in hand, a prize. The crowd, numbering 70 or so, soon gathered around, eager to see what it was. passing the booty from hand to hand with great care. The object finally got close enough for us to see that it was a gauge of some kind, with settings and indicators in English, numbers on dials. It fell down, they explained to us, from the tower. Incredulous, we asked, it fell down? With their smiles growing perceptibly wider, they had decided that the bluff was actually not worth pursuing any longer. Well, they concluded, it fell down when we pulled down the tower. The Mareña Project may have a powerful set of allies and all of the forces of transnational capital behind it, but it certainly does not have the approval of the men in the t-shirt masks. The anti-wind resistance has been able to catalyze challenges to wind energy development across the Isthmus, in part because they have raised explicit critiques of neoliberal forms of development and foreign financial intervention. But as we will detail here, the resistance has also found political purchase, not because it opposes renewable energy, they do not, but because they have surfaced concerns about both the potential social and environmental consequences that may follow in the wake of the wind park's construction. The resistance has codified a suite of concerns that range from displacing and destructive potential of megaprojects to worries about the loss of land and fish. La laguna, la pesca, and nuestra tierra, the lagoon, the fish, and our land, have become effectively aligned in order to gesture to both quotidian practices and regional patrimony as local residents call attention to environmental and social precarities that they believe that the wind parks portend. These eco-social alignments have also engendered distinct ways of imagining and articulating what I am calling Anthropocenic eco-authority, a series of experiential, scientific, and managerial truth claims regarding ecological knowledge and future forecasting in an era of global anthropogenic change. As it is enunciated by resident communities or state officials, corporate representatives, or environmental experts, Anthropocenic eco-authority finds traction by asserting ethical claims on behalf of and in regards to the anthropogenically altered future of the biosphere, both human and non-human. As the climate scholar Mike Howe has predicted more generally, climate change mitigation measures like those we have seen in Mexico have indeed fomented new opportunities for environmental consciousness and activism. However, it has not been the sort of environmentally oriented response that the Mareña Consortium or the Mexican state has hoped for. Although transitions to renewable energy have the ethical potential to leverage a global climatological good, when they are seen to contravene local claims for rights, autonomy, environmental knowledge, and ecological stewardship, they instead generate, as Mareña found, the conditions for failure. Our argument is, then, that where climate change mitigation efforts and renewable energy transitions are coupled with neoliberal development logics, we are likely to find resistance reinvented in collaborative and lateralist modes of activist response. The Office of the Assembly of Indigenous Peoples of the Isthmus in Defense of the Land and Territory is readily identified on the streets of Juchitán. It is one of the anti-wind turbine stencils on its facade. As we sat down one Sunday afternoon with two of the founders of the resistance and a couple of other attentive listeners, it was hard not to notice our intimate physical proximities in this tiny room decorated with images of past victories and heroes from Che to El Sub, that Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatista uprising. Roberto began our conversation and proceeded to detail the historical narrative of the resistance over the course of over an hour. Roberto is one of the primary voices of the resistance. He does not, however, like to be called a leader. This is a designation that he associates with hierarchical, vanguardist, and ultimately corrupt political forms. Roberto is a teacher by vocation and by nature, as became clear in his oration of historical events. The resistance against Mareña, he explained, must be understood through a longer genealogy that spans many decades and locations. In addition to the insurrectionary politics of the Isthmus, particularly the early COSEI movement that Dominic mentioned before, Roberto linked the resistance to the repression of the student movement in Mexico City in 1968 and a guerrilla insurgency in Chihuahua before that. He referenced the Chiapan rebellion of the Zapatistas following the North American Free Trade Agreement and the battle over the development of an airport in Atenco, just outside of Mexico City. He He likewise said that the anti-wind resistance is linked to the teachers' strike and state violence in the capital of Oaxaca in 2006, guided by APO, the Popular Assembly of the Peoples of Oaxaca. And finally, to Maoism itself, with its agrarian peasant insurgencies and challenges to first world imperialism. Roberto's cartography of revolution in response to foreign domination and urban hegemony brought us to the origins of the anti-wind resistance in 2005. It was founded, he explained, by a group of committed teachers. He and others had protested against the installation of a wind park in La Venta in the 1990s, noting that Subcomandante Marcos himself had shown up to speak in solidarity with them. Beyond the symbolic gestures of the Zapatista leadership, the Assembly of Indigenous Peoples could also claim several significant victories of their own. These included nullifying wind park contracts throughout the Isthmus region and, as Roberto put it, rescuing 1,200 hectares of land from being contracted and thus turned into wind parks. Roberto gives credit where credit is due, and he is faithfully citational as he narrates the insurrectionary lineage of the resistance. Originally, the Juchitan arm of the opposition worked under the name the People's Front in defense of the land and territory. However, Roberto explained the designation of front or frente is overly encumbered by vanguardism, hierarchical leadership, and military etymology, all qualities that they hoped to surpass. By consensus, it was decided that the title of Asamblea better described their ethos. An assembly evokes, as Roberto put it, quote, a more indigenous notion, that of community. He went on to explain, quote, we have traversed the entire historical process of the left in Mexico in order to be able to offer an alternative. Dedication to the collective model is also manifest in the deeds of the resistance, who have prioritized founding more asambleas as a central part of their mission. Asambleas Generales have since multiplied across the Isthmus in towns and villages, supporting the anti-Mareña resistance. These working forms of protest and process have called for a reinvented use of usos y costumbres, which is literally practices and customs or customary law, a legal and social system operating in parallel to state governance. Usos y costumbres have, in general, been regarded as a counterbalance to indigenous peoples' marginalization and elite national projects throughout Mexico and in other Latin American countries. And while the resistance has fostered collaborations that traverse historical divisions between local indigenous populations, they have also managed to navigate political party lines. Given the historical strength and chauvinism of party politics in Mexico, it is striking that PRI party loyalists would share meals with leftist Revolutionary Democratic Party, the PRD, or the COSEI. Since the political parties left and right have, for the most part, been in favor of the Mareña project, the parties themselves have actually lost favor in the eyes of Isthmeños in the resistance. In fact, they have gone so far as to summarily question the validity of political parties at all as legitimate democratic institutions. Antonio is one of the founders of the Asamblea in Álvaro and one of the key voices of the resistance. Speaking to a crowd one afternoon, Antonio announced to his compatriots in Álvaro Obregón that today is a declaration of war against the political parties, against the government, against Mareña Renovables, against everyone who is allied with or affiliates with Mareña Renovables. Antonio and others in the resistance also publicly announced that no political party candidate would be allowed to campaign for political office in the upcoming municipal elections. In June of 2013, they made good on this pronouncement by prohibiting the installation of any voting machines in the municipality. The parties and the park have become a combined menace for those in the resistance, and so both have been given a directive and a direction, and that direction is fuera, or out. Political and social disequilibria are a critical element of the opposition's discourse and their activism against the wind parks. However, the impacts upon the environment and subsistence in the Isthmus are equally resonant. The precise effect that the Mareña project might have on the fish or shrimp population of the lagoon and coastal waters is unclear, given that the environmental impact report failed to treat this aspect of the regional conditions and the project's unique placement on a sandbar. However, in part because of this absence of scientific analysis, fears continue to abound. The fishermen with whom we spoke across the Isthmus region were convinced that their lives and their livelihoods would be irrevocably impaired by the development of the wind park. Ibrahim, who would emerge as one of the key voices of the resistance in San Dionisio del Mar, summarized the sentiments of many in the region when he stated, "The wealth of our sea, of our people, of our source of work and nourishment is vital. If the wind project comes in, we will be buying foreign products coming from other places, which will make feeding ourselves more expensive." And so, in a sense, San Dionisio now sees itself, or has transformed itself, into a courageous town that defends its lands and teaches foreigners that our lands must be respected. It is telling that Ibrahim begins his comments with what he calls the riches of our sea. For over time, as the resistance to the project grew and spread, we began to hear increasingly the expression, el mar es nuestro banco, the sea is our bank. This is a canny spin on the evident presence, or perhaps better put, imposition, of banking interests and multinational capital that have backed the Mareña project. However, the sentiment that the sea is our bank is also a factual statement to a degree. According to reports, there are 5,000 indigenous families that rely on fishing for their existence. Even if the number of families in San Dionisio who survive exclusively by fishing are likely no more than a few dozen, many, if not the majority of the population, rely on fishing for a kind of security subsistence in conditions of economic and food insecurity. If all else fails, the sea is there, and you and your family can eat. Ibrahim is not naive, after all, to underscore how harm to fish and shrimp stocks will result in increased dependence on a market-based food supply and further insertion into a vast chain of imported products. Many advocates, Ibrahim included, were clear that opposition to the wind park was not a refusal of its clean capabilities and renewable energy aspirations. Rather, they wanted to mount a warning and a protest against the prioritization of market-based growth models spreading across every dimension of life in Mexico. Critiquing capitalist development and creating horizontal and collective political models, the anti-Mareña actions share an affinity with uprisings and protests from Tahrir Square to Zuccotti Park. Horizontal networks function in place of hierarchies, consensus democracy replaces top-down direction, and principles of decentralization become prioritized. Reacting to these projects of green neoliberalism, the resistance has been able to recapitulate the roots of the anti-globalization movements and direct actions that, for many, originated with the Zapatistas. Like the Zapatismo formed in the Lacandon jungle, or the anti-WTO protests in Seattle, or the protests against the G8 in Geneva, or most recently to occupy everything across North Africa, North America, and Europe, the resistance has rejected hierarchical orders and decision-making. It has made definitive critiques of the ways in which private finance capital may endanger local communities' livelihoods and well-being, and in this sense, we suggest energy protest movements in the Isthmus represent an outpost of the new opposition. However, there are at least two important distinctions to be made regarding Isthmeño responses to green neoliberalism that stand apart from occupiers' anti-globalization actions and neo-anarchist movements that have emerged in other parts of the world. First is their explicit incorporation of a collaborative neo-indigenous trajectory coupled with an adherence to a communal ideology of assembly. These tactics have been seen in other Latin American struggles over sovereignty and resources, to be sure, but anti-wind protests in the Isthmus signal an emerging logic of resistance that both rejects green capitalist aspirations as well as greenhouse gas reduction as justification for territorial displacements. The second distinction to be made is that the resistance in the Isthmus, unlike Occupy, is not reacting to a global financial crisis, but instead drawing attention to protracted forms of marginalization. In other words, they are reminding those that will listen that they have been the 99% for quite some time. In fact, the critique being leveled by the resistance is not aimed at the failure of global finance capital, but rather a scathing commentary on its very successful propagation across the Isthmus. In place of Wall Street banks that were too big to fail, the resistance has challenged a massive renewable energy installation that, with all of its international development and corporate sponsorship, has also seemed too big to fail, and yet, as of now, has. And in this sense, the refusal of the Mareña project is not simply a referendum on how renewable energy projects will proceed in Mexico, but a foreshadowing of potential resistances both north and south, where renewable energy projects may increasingly become objects of dissent. Andrew Chapman in his baseball hat with a thrashing fish embroidered across the front, and the young man behind his makeshift mask and the absconded wind meter in his hand represent very different places, both metaphorically and physically. Chapman has long since returned to New York, and the young man with the meter, he is likely either swapping stories with his friends at the hacienda, which is the outpost of the resistance that you see here, or he is out on the water hauling shrimp-filled nets from the lagoon by moonlight. There is no reason to make speculative parallels between the very different lives of each of these men and the economic, social, and cultural worlds that they represent. But it is fair to say that they do have shared expectations and parallel hopes for the future, if there were a way to meet at a metaphorical or an actual crossroads. Each of them is able to claim a virtuous, indeed ethical position. The American bringing development, fomenting markets for renewable energy use, slowing the creep of global warming, and producing profit for investors somewhat committed to sustainability. The Isthmeño fighting for his future on the lagoon and that of his one-day children, challenging foreign invaders and transnational capital, and working to ensure food sovereignty for himself, his family, and the region. There is likely no one in Álvaro Obregón, San Dionisio del Mar, or other communities around the Isthmus who would declare their outright opposition to preventing further climate change, or in the broadest terms, making the world and their environment a more humane and a more hospitable place. However, entreat them to sacrifice their land and fishing grounds on behalf of international global protocols and climate change mitigation mandates that are devised by government agents in climate conferences in Kyoto, Durban, Copenhagen, which in turn benefit investors and developers at least as far afield, is a proposition that does not sit well in the Isthmus. Asking Isthmeños to risk further precarity on behalf of global warming and an abstract greater global good may appear preferable to reenacting histories of corporate exploitation and extractivism. However, attempting to create this kind of engineered altruism has failed to gain much traction either. The Mareña project may indicate a series of particularities about the future of renewable energy in Mexico, but we do not believe that its contingencies are unique, as we see renewable energy transitions continue to develop and expand around the world. Instead, here we find a lesson in how disjointed development and failed attempts at sustainability resemble other projects that have taken market-based models as the only possible and rational solution to the threats of the Anthropocene. Perhaps especially in those places that have long been refused social goods and benefits promised by the state, we think that these resistances, refusals, and eco-social responses highlight a fundamental challenge at the heart of renewable energy development. But in failure, we also know lies its obverse, and that is a way to surface opportunities, to rethink the possible, and to refigure our ethical commitments, and to re-examine the nature of power in the present. So let me end with a coda, and that is an update on what has happened with the Mareña Park since we ended this particular phase of research. The Mareña Park sort of quietly dissolved in the summer of 2013 and sort of disappeared in vivo and then online, as the website was also taken offline in December 2013, just sort of dissipated into the ether. We have heard many rumors of relocation. So supposedly the organizations and the transnational capital that were formed around the Mareña project have again switched names, but the capital appears to be the same. The park will putatively, possibly, it's a rumor, be taken inland, where they will actually be able to place the park. So these are the stories that we have heard, that the environmental impact reports that will be needed for moving the park inland to a different site will be fast-tracked, and that it will operate under a new name and a new guise, but that the energy generation may in fact happen. So this is the update in the coda, and we really look forward to hearing more from you all, questions, thoughts, and reflections. Thank you.
did they offer like scholarships for the guys who were the local guys in order to study, for example, electric engineering or to study wind farms in terms of engineering, or I don't know, a local community center, a cultural community center. I don't know if you know about it, if there was something about it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the example of scholarships is an interesting one because there are other wind park propositions and corporations that have actually been put into place that are offering scholarships to some local people in the region, male and female. That was not something that was part of the profile of the Mareña project. What they were very interested in doing was building a community health center, a cultural center, a community center, and then doing a lot of road paving. And that, this is one case of one particular project, but what we found throughout the Isthmus region in the 3 case studies that we did and more broadly in the region was that road paving was a high priority by many of the companies. And it's true, as you can see by the pictures here, and why we try and emphasize this quality of dust. And it's a very windy place, obviously. Some of the strongest wind in the world and some of the best wind for generating renewable energy. But there are also a lot of spaces that are unpaved and dirt and stones. And so people talk about this as kind of a menace. But one of the things that's failed in other parts of the region is that road paving has not necessarily gone well, where it has been done in a faulty way, having no drains, for example, so that when it rains, and it does rain, the water backs up and sort of comes back up into people's toilets, and there are all kinds of problems with the way that the paving has happened. So that's the kind of instrumental problem with road paving, which seems to be the priority here. But the kind of more symbolic problem with paving is that people see it as simply a way for the company to be able to move their trucks, their vehicles, their equipment more easily and quickly through the region. That in a sense it's not meant to be something to help local communities, that really it's just another effect of capital trying to find a quicker way into the isthmus through literally paving the roads.
I'm asking this question because I remember in 2012, maybe, there was another park built, and it was kicked off. It was kicked off by the president, and more people went there. I think it was up in the site. It's like I think it was Acciona. Mm-hmm. They were having trouble around 2010 with the community, because when they were dealing with the local people, they were offering for example, like private goods to the leaders.
Yeah.
So a lot of people was there like, we're going to face the cost. I mean, in a different word, we were saying this. We're going to face the cost, but others are going to get like in our community, the others are going to be making a profit. So they were having trouble. So the idea was like to open it instead of. The federal government couldn't control, these kind of things by the companies and the local guys. So what the federal government tried to incentivize was to offer public goods, like the idea of a new university there, especially for engineering and that kind of things, like to make it more transparent and more accountable, the process. Mm-hmm. And this park went good. It was built, it started working, but also it had trouble when it was in the very first day of its operation, because more people came from other places to block the starting of the park, for example. So this story that I want to share, it tells you a lot about how the local communities can start can take these parks also with the right set of incentives, to call it in a way, or with a better way of bringing or sharing the cost and putting them the benefits.
Do you want to talk about the Ixtapec project?
Yeah, I should. Yeah, thank you for that comment. And it is there's a lot to say about how the Mareña both exemplifies and doesn't exemplify, and is sort of an outlier to this developmental process. And we could say more about that. But I will say that one of our other case studies was the effort to build the first community-owned wind park in all of Latin America, too, also a story of failure, but for different reasons, in that the way in which, and it's a complicated story, but the way in which these new kind of, the new sort of renewable energy policies were written, and the way in which especially the electricity utility, which is a monopoly, CFE, operates, meant that you could only be allowed to bid on getting access to the grid if you had a very large amount of capital already in the bank. So a sort of small, poor community couldn't, for example, say, well, if you give us the access, then we'll go and like look for finance for it and raise the money, and then distribute part of that back, part of whatever the proceeds are back to the people who lent us money, but then also keep the other, a large part of it not for shareholder profit, but rather for developing, local goods, hospital, and which is what they wanted to do, and to put a lot of money back into the community again. Right now, in these projects, typically the communities get less than 3% of the profit from the electricity generation. So that's the basic model, is very little. And they were saying, we'll give them 50%. 50% of the profits will go back into the community. So it's a big difference. But they weren't even allowed to bid because they weren't able to show that they had enough. They had a very, because they've been working with NGOs in Mexico City and with support from European organizations as well. And they had developed a very credible plan, but weren't even allowed to sort of put it into practice. So these community, I think you're right that the sort of community model is very desirable. A lot of people who hear about it like it. But then people who are in the sort of more corporate world, or the for-profit world, felt that this was sort of absolutely crazy, and we heard nothing but sort of derision of this plan from many of the bankers or sort of wind industry people that we talked with, who also had a kind of, I have to say, very ambivalent relationship on how much they should be investing in local infrastructure. Their feeling was that, we are, giving you some jobs, and we're giving you all this electricity, and you're taxing us. I.e. the government, should be the ones who are responsible for building the roads and for building the schools and so forth. But Oaxaca is the second poorest state in Mexico. Its state government can't raise taxes. It's not allowed to. None of the states in Mexico can raise their own taxes. So it all comes from sort of begging from the federal government, which is a long way away culturally and sort of geographically from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So here you have this like kind of long, neglected, abandoned region, which is being asked to sort of take a front-leading role in Mexico's campaign for renewable energy development, which to us here sounds great, right? I mean, it sounds great. Except that from the point of view locally, it seems as though there's a whole lot of other issues that should be dealt with first before we sort of enter, because there wasn't trust. There wasn't a sense that we've been able to benefit from other development projects in the past. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the talk. And I look forward to seeing, what did you call it, a duograph in time. But I had two questions actually, and one has to do with this impasse that you painted for us, and with which you actually started and ended up with. And I think you do a very nice job of actually, as you're narrating the conflict, of making us, the audience, root for one side and then root for the other, and then end up very frustrated at these two very compelling ethical stances. And in a sense, somewhat at a loss for, on one hand, where to position ourselves as engaged audience, and particularly when it comes to energy, one ought to be, I think, an engaged audience. One cannot help, I think, but to be in a position, to put itself into a position of engaged audience. So on one hand, there is a frustration of thinking literally where to root, where to position one's sympathies. And in a sense, you profess your own sympathies as being divided and divided across the two sides. So on one hand, I'm wondering, where do you point from here? And if I'm not mistaken, I'm actually hearing you to take the indigenous critique of a particular model, of the particular economic model that is undergirding the sustainable development, as being the message, perhaps, a critical kind of a message to be taken from this impasse. So I don't know if that's something I'm picking out, but that's not necessarily where your emphasis lies. But I'm just basically wondering, what do you do painting this impasse, and where are you pointing? And the other question that I have is basically wondering about energy more broadly as a kind of metaphor or a certain kind of animacy in the ways in which Chen, for instance, is talking about these different metaphysical forces or objects out there that are creating certain kinds of animating effects in the world. So I'm wondering, how does energy figure more broadly, either in Oaxaca or in Mexico? In other words, are there imaginaries of alternative energies? Are there discourses of energy-imbued objects? Are there discourses of elements as generating energies? Are there energy drinks? Are there energy medical treatments and alternative therapies and so forth? And I'm wondering about it because energy is such a compelling force to think about, deeply metaphysical, isn't it? But I'm also wondering, because we've got here an alternative political proposition here, one of radical horizontality, a certain kind of very different power that is being proposed by Roberto, the teacher, not the leader, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, how does this notion of power translate, or does it translate into some sense of energy, some sense of power that can be harnessed as well? This might be somewhat vague.
Maybe, I mean, there's a lot there in both of your questions, I think, so maybe we can move back and forth between it. The question, I'll just start with the energy drinks, because that was a nice moment. I mean, there are energy drinks in Mexico, and there are, sort of alternative medicines and people who are interested in crystals and different ways of sort of moving energy through the body. We didn't spend a lot of time focused on that, but it does exist. You can kind of see it in the popular imaginary. One of the things that we were interested to see operating in Mexico, and I think this has to do with the metaphysics and the semiotics of energy as well, is how much people love Pemex, the national oil company, how invested they are in it, how important they feel it is to keep it as a national resource, to keep sort of national and patrimonial control over these resources that lie under the ground, right? The black sun, right, of the petroleum source. Both financially and I think symbolically in the national imaginary. And how much people hate the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, which is also a monopoly. It's kind of a parastate, but it is the monopolistic control over electricity. So there's these two polarities, if I can use a kind of electric metaphor, between petroleum and electricity, especially in the way that infrastructures and the way that these products or these essences are managed. So that was an interesting juxtaposition. One of the things we were also trying to get at, I think, was this question of the wind, because one of our initial questions, even before we began the long-term research, was what would be the different sort of effective relationship that people would have with those resources that lie, in the subterranean, those resources that are beneath our feet, that are understood to be part of nuestra tierra, right, really heart and soul, versus those quote-unquote resources that blow overhead, right, from the north to the south, that are here and then they're gone, and they sort of sweep across the land, sometimes causing trouble, sometimes cooling the skin and making it feel good, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways that people talk about the wind. So one of the questions that we asked people, we did the only community survey that's ever been done in one of these small communities in the Isthmus, a small community called La Ventosa, which is completely surrounded by wind parks. So we wanted to ask people, who owns the wind? Like, to whom does the wind belong? And there are, of course, stories and indigenous myths about the meaning of the wind. The north wind is very masculine, it's hard, it's brutal, it's what makes you tough. It picks up stones and smacks you in the face with them. It really hardens you, right? This is a kind of a story of pride. The wind from the south is the southern wind. It's cooling, it's refreshing, it kind of takes the heat off the day. So there are these kind of mythos of the wind, but we wanted to try and understand how it might be reconceptualized. And I think going back to your question, as an energy source or as a kind of material, if passing, effect on people. So I don't know if that gets at some of the kind of metaphysical semiotics of, it's not quite energy exactly, but both of them, because this wind is being turned into energy that then goes to Coca-Cola and Heineken and Walmart, and it doesn't stay in the community. So that electricity does not reside in these local spaces any longer. It goes much farther afield to very particular actors.
I guess all I would add, so as not to make our answer go on too long, is just that I think that, in terms of the coming to terms with the crisis of petropower is really interesting in Mexico too, because it's something that I guess on a day-to-day basis, average citizens who we spent a lot of time talking with had no sort of connection with at all for the most part. People think of the power of Pemex, they think of the power and the pride and the fact that a lot of what Mexico has been able to accomplish in its sort of development as an industrial society owes a lot to the nationalization of oil, oil in the Cardenas regime. That actually helped to sort of spur Mexico's growth into a really vibrant industrial economy. But today, we did a lot of interviews in government, and there it got really interesting, because in the government, people know, and people are concerned, and they know that the model is very, very fragile. That, as I said, the state depends to such a high degree. And in fact, when we interviewed Calderon, we were able to interview Calderon a couple of months ago, and he said actually it was 43%. So 43% of all of the government's budget comes from oil sales. And those oil sales production is declining really fast. So what's going to fill that gap? And so within the government, there's a lot of concern about that, and yet sort of in the way there is here too, where part of the coming to awareness of the Anthropocene is sort of, yes, on the one hand, we need to make changes, but actually really underestimating the magnitude of those changes that need to be made. And so there's a lot, I think that's where I get into sort of psychoanalysis becomes interesting, is there's a lot of repression of this fact, and a lot of displacements and a lot of symptoms and a lot of symbols that are sort of going out in all different directions. So I think that, one of the interesting things to chart in this, and that we'll be doing a lot of work on in the book, is to look at the way in which energy does inform the political imagination, as well as the ethical imagination, the ecological imagination of people living in Mexico today, because I think it'll offer some interesting case studies and sort of comparative material for thinking about, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the United States, and so forth too, where again, I think it's a very epistemically interesting time.
If I could just quickly say too, because the question that you started with was this kind of positioning, and I'm glad that you had that reaction and that feeling, because that is precisely the feeling and the reaction that we had doing this field work for much of the time, and that is that we are supporters of transitioning to renewable energy forms, personally, politically, and to see it continue to fail in so many different dimensions in so many ways is really, it's quite disappointing. And it gave us a lot of ambivalence around the process. And so that's how we came to this recognition that these forms that have sort of fueled the oil industry and all of the energy generation and consumption that has led us to this moment of the Anthropocene is no longer a functional model as we hope to transition to new forms of energy and an energy future. And at least in terms of the ethical, we often talk about transition, renewable energy transition, as an ethical question, as a global ethical question. And what we're trying to draw attention to here is to think of it in terms of its ethical particularities on the ground in those sites where renewable energy forms are being instituted and instantiated. And these seem to usually, if not always, be places that are somewhat on the margins, that, where the wind blows the strongest, where the sun shines the brightest, et cetera, et cetera. These are the kinds of spaces that we want to make sure that there is ethical attention to both those scales as we look, hopefully, towards a new energy future, we hope.
Not to oversimplify, you had Timothy Mitchell come here, and anyone who, I hope people were able to see Timothy Mitchell speak, because he's really brilliant on the relationship between energy infrastructure and political power. And, part of what we're doing anthropologically is taking his work, I think, parts of it, and trying to generalize it and make it have sort of travel better analytically in some ways, to take it just out of that story about the birth of carbon democracy. Yeah, and it's a really interesting moment to be sort of analyzing this, because there are these new renewable energy infrastructures that are sort of struggling to be born, and with them, I think, new politics that are struggling to be born, but they're being repressed left and right, because we have the two voices. So we have the voice of the kind of renewable energy advocate, the green capitalist, and indigenous activist on the other side. But what we're missing there, of course, are the huge megaphone voices of people who want to maintain petropower more or less in its current form, with a few tweaks and things here, and the shale revolution and so forth. So that's a missing part of the story in this paper, but I think it's part of the broader picture of that. And I do, again, not to simplify it, but there is some connection between these renewable energy infrastructures struggling to be born and these more lateral, decentered politics. And that's something that I think you can get to through Mitchell, but even more clearly through the work of Hermann Scheer, who was a sort of renewable energy advocate, a politician in Germany who helped build the successful tariff laws that actually made Germany into a solar energy powerhouse despite having virtually no insulation. Really talked a lot about how different materialities and infrastructures of energy can generate new political possibilities.
Quickly on this last point, I'm really interested in if you guys can elaborate on how you guys are thinking about collaboration, particularly in terms of, say, these government and corporate officials finding themselves dependent on this uproar from, say, this alternative imaginary about what counts as renewables. How is that staking the claims in terms of how these, who could, I guess, generally understand as experts, are understanding their claims around renewables?
Collaboration between...
So what counts as collaboration? I heard that come up often throughout the talk. I'm just wondering about how that's being understood here.
Oh, I see. So collaboration between the developers and the communities who might have different... Yeah, okay. Because there's a lot of of dimensions of collaboration in the project. I just want to be sure I'm responding to the right
in
aspect
terms of
there.
content instead of form.
Right.
Yeah.
That has been one of the things that really, as we dug deeper and deeper into trying to understand some of the contention and impasse that was in this case particularly, it became clear to what extent there is, again, an enormous, you can only call it kind of cultural gulf between what's happening in Mexico City and even Oaxaca City and what's happening in a region like the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The people who were making decisions about these projects had very rarely visited the Isthmus and talked to people directly. They really were making their decisions based upon consultant reports and based upon, and there's been developed a sort of a local caste of powerful local landowners in the Isthmus who have taken it upon themselves to speak for the people. And they talk to them, and they bring them to Oaxaca City, and they bring them to Mexico City. And so you'll get these people who are incredibly wealthy, who are being sort of, this is our average compass, who's going to sort of benefit from this, like, what's his name? Well, anyway, we don't need to name names, but there are these folks. And so collaboration exists on those levels, I think, between political elites, nationally, at the state level and local level too. A lot of collaboration, a lot of conversation, and we're able to get involved with some of that. But between sort of, especially these more remote communities, these fishing villages, which have excellent wind resources, but have not really, in a lot of ways, been incorporated within the state apparatus of Mexico in any meaningful way. I mean, even the sort of basic utilities don't exist, and the police presence is iffy, and so forth. So they're really sort of existing in a kind of gray zone. Their collaboration has been next to nothing. But there have been collaborative forms that have existed, interestingly, between NGOs, especially those that are moving for this community level, community-oriented wind development, and those communities. A lot of collaboration, a lot of conversation between the resistance to the big projects and the effort to develop a community park. But there, too, there was ambiguities, because there were a lot of people in the resistance who didn't like even the community park idea, right? Mm-hmm. They would ally themselves to fight like Mareña, but then when it came whether wind parks at all were a good idea, then it would be, well, I'm not sure that's a mega proyecto. I'm not sure that we want to do that at all. Mm-hmm. So collaboration, I guess you could go through many forms: conversation, exchange. There are different aspects to it. But there were part of, I guess you could say, what was missing and what led to a lot of these problems was that there wasn't any kind of collaboration of a meaningful, intense kind over time. And we signaled a little bit in one of those slides about how there had been a kind of cartel organization that was set up. Once companies were given their part of the Isthmus, they didn't really focus on, they sort of assumed that was their territory to develop, and they would go and they would talk to the local leaders and try to get them on their side. But past that, there was no more deeper dialogue.
There is, I'll just give a couple of other ethnographic moments. So we had a very interesting conversation with the regulator, the federal regulator of electricity for the entire country of Mexico, who more than 2 or 3 times during an hour-long conversation said how proud he was and how proud the country was that they didn't subsidize renewable energy in any way, shape, or form in Mexico. And he kept saying, you know, it's not like you gringos in the north. We haven't done it like you guys have done it. Right, you're laughing, but it's right. You know, it's been a completely government legislated, you know, the policy constructs so that government can allow private partnerships, collaborations to come in and develop these resources. So it's almost wholly private, independent, and privatized neoliberal in that way. So that's a kind of legal structure that's in place. We showed a couple of slides from these protests that we went to in Mexico City, and that was very interesting to see too, because these protests took place in front of the Inter-American Development Bank, in front of the Mitsubishi Corporation, in front of the Danish embassy, because Denmark fabricates a lot of the aspas, the blades for the wind turbines. So that, you know, this kind of mobile protest that happened. And then when we were in this very, you know, sort of elegant part of Mexico City, these very well-dressed Mexico City residents were walking by and kind of under their breath, or maybe not so much under their breath, saying, you know, it's just NIMBY, NIMBY, NIMBY. So here are these people who don't want this kind of development in their quote-unquote backyard. But we think that there's something different operating here. This is not about, you know, you're spoiling my view off the coast of Cape Cod, or I don't like the way that the landscape looks with these white towers upon it. It's not an aesthetic kind of question. I mean, there was a very interesting quote that we heard from a fisherman in Alvaro who said, you know, we've been waiting 30 years for someone to come in here and pave these roads, because it's all dirt roads in Alvaro, and it's a very marginalized community. We've been waiting 30 years for the government to come in here and pave these roads, for any company to come in here and pave these roads, and it's been 30 years and they haven't done it. And you know what? Even if they do it now, if we can't fish and we can't gather shrimp, we'll have no way to live and subsist, and so we'll have to leave anyway. And so no one will be here to enjoy those paved roads. And so this idea of this disarticulation between the metropole of Mexico City and what's happening in these spaces in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is it's a huge gap of understanding and perspective, I'd say. So those are just a couple of examples, I think, that hopefully illustrate that.
Thank you very much. I just had a small question based on some things you said before, and also the slides. So there's a lot of wonderful exposition about the ethics and the politics around this. I'm wondering a little bit about the aesthetics of politics, both on the side of the wonderful computer generated image of what power would look like, green power, and also the rich kind of iconography of stencils, for example, block letters. I mean, all the slides that you show are this very public kind of aesthetic form of expression, both signs, people holding signs, things like that, that imply that this is an aesthetics that's mediated by a kind of vision too, right? That there's a kind of communicative form that's underlying the kind of resistance. It's not just physical violence, right? Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I don't think you see in the paper, but that was present during our entire fieldwork period, was the very canny way that the resistance uses video and YouTube and the internet and email communication and Facebook to constantly keep informed with what is happening, what the state government is doing, what the federal government is doing, what the military is doing, what the state police are doing. I mean, they're very, very fast. And sort of have their agents, their activist agents all over the Isthmus to be able to monitor what's happening. And this stuff gets out very, very quickly. And we had a kind of a, I don't know, an incorporation into this sort of mediated aesthetic at one point when we came to Alvaro for the first time and encountered this conflict between the state police and local people. And we had taken video documentation after kind of testing the waters for a second, but took some images. And then were asked by the resistance if they could use our video to then craft this little short film sort of explaining what had happened and how the state police had come in and abused people. And so then it became this aesthetic document, this mediated document that I think continues to live on YouTube. But it was it's a political piece with a very specific orientation. So there's no way to, I don't think, there's no way to not inhabit that particular mediation that they're very, very savvy and astute about creating.
Yeah, I would just to add to that list. Also, for later on, as the sort of anti-Mareña campaign really got into full swing, they found some artists to do these amazing cartoons, these cartoon series in which they would sort of be kind of this and with the Spanish conquistador. Because Mareña, I'm trying to think now, really the capital wasn't even coming from Spain, it was coming from Australia and Japan and Holland. But the Spanish, a big part of this is the idea of the sort of Segunda Conquista, like the second conquest of the Spanish, because a lot of the wind development is coming from Spanish wind firms who are getting pushed out of Spain because of the disastrous economy in Spain. They're coming to Mexico to build jobs for their engineers, as well as really lucrative investment possibilities. The average return on these parks is not public, but we found a banker who's willing to tell us is 15%. So there's an expected return on investment of 15% for these parks for all the people involved in the development process. It's a lot of money, right? More than we can hope for in our savings accounts, yes? So that gives you a sense of why there's such enthusiasm there. So they had cartoons of people in these conquistador outfits coming and talking to the poor campesinos and outwitting them, but it's done in a very clever way, very visually vivid sort of way. And then the other thing, since you mentioned violence, is that there was a period where the company, I want to blame it on the company because I'm not sure that they were doing it. It was the company's allies, sort of political allies who were doing this, who were sort of rounding up, hit squads would be too strong, but gangs of people who were threatening individuals in the resistance or making death threats, who were showing up at their houses at odd hours, who in one case, Pinkertons. Yeah, Pinkertons, exactly. Yeah. Who destroyed the community radio station in Juchitán. And at that point, they moved into, there was a kind of a development of a visual language of violence, of like the impact of violence, and which was going out through their WordPress page and going out through their Facebook as well too, with these pictures of lesions and people, being bruised and beaten with broken arms. Where there was I think, again, careful and sincere, but a very careful effort to cultivate a certain image of the physically victimized indigenous subject that then circulated really well in the North, right? They could get this, and some members of this movement actually have made it to the European Parliament to give testimony. I mean, they've been very astute, like incredibly astute, I think, and able to use all the different media at their disposal to make themselves, and I wouldn't say there are way more than 20 people involved in this resistance, there are probably several hundred, but they made themselves seem much larger by being able to create a mediated presence that far exceeds their sort of local networks on the ground.
I mean, I think it's an interesting dimension. I mean, you mentioned the homologies between different kind of political movements in different places, and a kind of lateral sociology and also kind of political ideology. But it strikes me that the aesthetics of this is also a kind of interesting continuity that makes this not an isolated case, but that links in. And it's at the aesthetic level in some sense. I mean, not that you would really want to reify aesthetics as being distinct, but it strikes me very, very interesting that you'll see the same kind of aesthetic motifs. It's not just the same kind of politics, it's not the same kind of ideological positions, but also the same aesthetic forms that are circulating. Most interesting.
Yeah, very good.
Well, let us thank Cymene, Howe, and Dominic Boyer.